Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We wanted to take the time out to talk about the idea of studying fiqh. And before doing that, I wanted to talk about the idea of evidence, which is dominant in the Muslim popular consciousness or discourse of the general community. The concept of a dalil was popularized by the Salafi da'wah, but the Salafi da'wah was not an exclusive da'wah effort that was pushing the idea of dalil. You had also the Muslim Brotherhood in the context of the book that is entitled Al-Usul al-Ashreen, or the 20 Principles lil Fahm, 20 Principles of Understanding, that were written by Hassan al-Banna. And it's the first 20 principles that come up in Risat al-Ta'lim, in the Treatise of Education. He also called to the idea of evidence-based learning. And they were not the only ones, the Salafi Da'wah and Hassan al-Banna. This was a push that we saw among a number of scholars, but they became popular. The reason why we mentioned Hassan al-Banna was because he was the one that advised Sayyid Sabiq to compile Fiqh Sunnah. And he did so in the context of when Sayyid Sabiq was a student in Al-Azhar. What was happening in the context of Egypt was that there was a lot of conflict between the four madhab in terms of the followers of the four madhab. And so people began to equate the madhab that they follow with the deen, so that if another madhab took another position which was contrary to the position that a particular follower of a school was following, then it would be labeled, understood, conceived of as being going against the deen. And it didn't stop there. There were a number of scenarios historically that were dominant, and one of them was the reluctance of intermarrying, like in the case of the Hanafis and the Shafi'is. There was the issue of multiple salah prayed in one masjid based on the madhab idea. There was, even this issue was dominant in Saudi Arabia. And it was really dismantled, the problem of multiple salawat behind different imams based on the madhab. Each group that was following a particular madhab will establish salah unto its own, not come in one salah line, so to speak, behind one imam. And that problem was dismantled, or it was addressed by people like Sheikh Ibn Baz, who invited one of the people from Ansar al-Sunnah, his name is not coming to mind at the moment, to lead the salah in Saudi. And from there, the idea of multiple salawat was a non-practice issue, and the different madhab were combined together. Now, places like Saudi, because of Hajj, you were having multiple, were having people come from different backgrounds. In Egypt, you have just an eclectic of different ideas and practices that exist. But in any event, that was what the state and the context behind the writing of Fiqh Sunnah was, to bring back to the people the basics and the understanding of the Sunnah, so that they can realize that the deen is rooted in revelation, and that they can realize an easy way to comprehend and practice. Because by this time, fiqh also becomes something of the area of expertise, difficult to understand, difficult to study, difficult to practice at times, unless you continue your studies beyond the basic levels. So there was also grave illiteracy, which was striking, which led to that issue. And there was a lot of problems on the ground with the issue of confusion and bid'ah and other things that were in existence. And this was not only a concern for people like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Ikhwan Muslimin, the Ansar al-Sunnah was also before the Ikhwan, and it was one of the oldest madhabs, or I'm sorry, one of the oldest da'wah efforts around, and it was concerned with that, and it was birthed out of Al-Azhar al-Sharif, with people like Hamid Fiqhi and Ahmed Shakir and a number of others, that were there, and that's a discussion in and of itself. But even when we look into the Indian subcontinent, there was an effort to attempt to address the issue of bid'ah among the Deobandi scholars who were Hanafi scholars. And this issue was due to the problem that the people were encountering when they were dealing with Hindu culture and so on and so forth. So that's why you find in Maulana Thanawi's books, specifically Bahishti Zuhur, that he notes that there are certain practices which are anti-Islam, in addition to certain practices which had crept in among the Sufis. And this is one of the reasons why Maulana Thanawi talks about his efforts at eliminating bid'ah in certain Sufi circles, and he talks about that there was much more remaining to be addressed, but that he made, an effort in that regard. It was recognizing that. And so those are just examples to say that this idea was there among the scholars. So with the push towards hadith that was seen all throughout the Muslim world, and part of the push towards hadith came in because of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So people began to ask the question as to why are the Muslims in decline? And this was a popular question for a long time in Muslim circles, among Muslims in general. Even here in the US, that question was posited quite often prior to 9/11. It was a question that was brought to the Muslim community in the US by the Muslims overseas, in which they were questioning the decline of the Muslim civilization and so on and so forth. And to document that, when you look at some talks that Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya gave here in the US that are recorded, this type of question comes up and he addresses the issue accordingly. And so in any event, the push towards hadith was a response of the ulama for about the last 100 years or so towards reviving the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the affair, the decline of the Muslims, was looked at as having been the result of Muslims pushing away from the sunnah of the Prophet. That was one of the responses that Muslims gave, was to turn back to the knowledge of Islam, specifically the knowledge of prophetic practice and guidance, and to attempt to re-engage it, reorient with it. And so that led to various different tendencies and different movements, whether it was what we saw with Shaykh Uthman bin Fodi and the push back toward the Sunnah, what we saw with Shah Waliullah, what we saw also with Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, what we saw with people like before Shaykh Uthman bin Fodi, like Shahristani, or even Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq. And there's a number of other ulama, and all of these scholars are not of the same tendency, or not even of the same ilk. And sometimes they come in different time periods, very closely intertwined with each other. Dr. Abdul Hakim Quick, at one point in time, he did a talk about the interconnectedness of the scholars of revival across the board, how they were interconnected by way of isnad. And so you see sometimes the scholars that have become popular in today's time, not necessarily in our time itself, but within the last 100 years, especially towards the fall of the Ottoman Empire, or as soon as it was falling, you find that they had people in common, or they had things in common. Even someone as distinct as Bediüzzaman Sayyid Nursi, who was one of the last scholars of the Ottoman Empire. There were a few of them that were in existence and became popular and had lasting effect. Sayyid Nursi was one of those figures that also called back to the Quran and the Sunnah, and he had his unique way of addressing that issue. But one of the things that he talked about was the importance of reorienting oneself towards the Sunnah and so on and so forth. So this push towards hadith, it led eventually to a questioning of the way that the books in fiqh were written. And part, at least at the basic level, because at the more advanced levels, the issue of evidence, whether it is considered foundational, methodological, principled evidence, or whether it is a referencing of detailed ayat of the Quran and the hadith to support a position, that's not an issue. You find a discussion on evidences in every madhab of the four madhab, and even outside of the four madhab, especially as a point of reference when you look at Imam Ibn Hazm. His book is full of evidences. And other ulama or other scholars as well, that their books were at one time manuscripts but became dominant. In any event, the higher level texts are never an issue when it comes to furnishing evidence. The problem comes with the foundational text, right? So that's one of the issues that we confront. So especially with the Salafi da'wah, there was a lot of critical questioning. Sometimes it went beyond the boundaries of respect, and at times it did not. That's, we're now dealing with the issue of deficiency and excess. Deficiencies in excess in a da'wah movement. But what it did was that it forced a reevaluation. Shaykh al-Albani's work, Sifat al-Salat al-Nabi, Sifatu Salat al-Nabi, his work, originally published in 3 volumes, then it was abridged into 1 volume. It led to a lot of discussion with regard to Salah, so much so that the British Deobandi scholar, Maulana Riyad al-Haq, or Sheikh Riyad al-Haq, he wrote the book, The Prayer of the Believer According to the Quran and the Sunnah. It's 1 volume, it deals mostly with Salah, but is an attempt to respond back to the criticisms that came on the fore with regard to how the Hanafi school prays, and the idea that it is not rooted in evidence. So that was a constructive type of engagement in which you started to see that people began to respond, not necessarily in just a matter of baseless, empty refutation, but in somewhat of a scholarly type of way. Well, many of the scholars took this on earlier on. It was not just a recent phenomenon, but I give that as an example. And they began to either furnish a hadith. The Umeri brothers, actually, when you look at the Umeri family, Abdul Aziz and Abdullah. Abdul Aziz was much more pronounced in his hadith scholarship, but Abdullah was recognized as well as the other Umeri brothers. But those two, but Ahmed al-Umeri, Abdul Aziz, he had noted the issue of evidences. And there's actually Ahmed as well. They come on the scene and they start talking about how it was that the Maliki school was deficient. The Maliki school, the way that the writing was dominant in the later times among the scholars, was one that was a type of writing that was bereft or was lacking in the way of the older scholars, which was pretty much to furnish evidences, right? It was pretty much established to furnish evidences. That was the way of the early scholar, and to comprehend the bases of the deen, And I had to pause because I mentioned Ahmed and I was thinking Jamaluddin Abu Yusuf Abdul Aziz Siddiq al-Umari, and he wrote his sharh on al-Ashmawiyya, and he talked about the issue of coming back to evidences. Abdullah as well, he wrote a commentary, hadith-based commentary on the Risala of Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani. And by the way, around that time when he was writing, I don't think that the explanation of Qadi Abdul Wahhab was published for the Risala, which furnishes tons of proof. Qadi Abdul Wahhab al-Maliki, from the scholars of Iraq, and he wrote the scholars of Iraq, the Maliki school in Iraq has some distinctive features that make it unique among the different tendencies within the Maliki school. And we don't have the time to get into that. But, his books were always furnishing evidences. As a matter of fact, the school of Medina itself, the Maliki school, started off with Muwatta. So it was a hadith-based school from the beginning. It was always a school that was engaged in hadith. But you started to see different tendencies, like the school of Egypt. It emerged in such a way that it began to be focused on the statements of the scholars, statements of Malik, and the statements that are used in the Mudawwana and so on and so forth. And so that led to a sort of kind of writing, which was not as profoundly organized in terms of working with the evidences as we saw, for instance, in the school of Iraq or the school of Al-Andalus and Al-Maghrib and stuff like that. And that needs a conversation itself. I'm somewhat talking loosely. But in any event, the idea of mentioning that was to say that the manuscript of Qadi Abdul Wahhab was in existence. It is noted that he was writing with evidences, but it was not published. So people like the Gumeri brothers, right? People like Jamaluddin and Abdullah and Abdul Aziz, especially Abdul Aziz, who was known to be a hadith master. They were not necessarily part of the movement Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. And as a matter of fact, Sheikh Al-Albani likewise was not necessarily part of the movement Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, although Sheikh Al-Albani is noted for the Salafi tendency, right? But he trekked a specific path, and he followed in many ways, what was the pathway of the scholars of Yemen and Rashid Rida as well, which they attempted to revive the whole idea of hadith study and so on and so forth. But the madhahib, in any event, the scholars of the time in our time period, they responded back, and many of them began to publish books that were evidence-based for the madhahib. Of those books is Al-Fiqh al-Minhaji by Sheikh Mustafa al-Khin and Sheikh Mustafa al-Bugha and Sheikh Ali al-Sharbaji. This is only volume 1, published by, translated by Sheikh Mahdi Laq. And it's in Shafi'i fiqh, and it's one of the best written books in the contemporary age in Shafi'i fiqh, focus on evidences and focus on teaching the student how to understand evidences. Now, there should be some book that's written, that studies prior to this, but it works. You know what I'm saying? If with a good teacher, it works. Another book that was translated actually, and this is by one of my favorite scholars, Mullah Ali Qari, who's a Hanafi scholar of Hadith. This one was based on his work, right? It was based on Mullah Ali Qari's work, and it is called Five Pillars of Islam by Rajab Dolan, Turkish brother. He did a pretty decent job. The outline of it is amazing. I've taught this before. It is not only focused on the Hanafi madhab, it also talks about the other madhab, but the root, the base, the grounding, the orientation is Hanafi with evidences, and is open to other schools of thought. This is the same way that Qadi Abdul Wahhab writes when he in most of his books, Al-Maliki. And also Qadi Banapati, who was a student of Thana Allah Banapati, and Ma La Buddu Minhu, which is essential knowledge. It was translated by Mullah Yusuf Talal de Lorenzo. He takes that type of approach too, because Shah Wali Allah rahmatullahi alayhi took that type of approach as well. Sheikh Uthman bin Fodi also took that type of approach, to mention other schools and to mention the openness that we should have to other schools while being grounded in a particular school, but being open to other schools. So that tendency emerged amongst the scholars in different ways. So a lot of the works that came about, they responded fairly well to the demand of hadith revival, even though we went through bumps as an ummah in terms of debating these issues, but at the end, it brought tons of benefit. But when we talk about these types of books that were mentioned, this is Hanafi, this is Shafi'i, in orientation, these types of books in many ways should be the focus of the student of knowledge. The traditional books, in the sense of popular books among people of tradition, many of them are beneficial, but contemporary books have their value. This is not a contemporary book, by the way. This is part of a bigger book by Sharh al-Naqaya by Mullah Ali Qari. Is only the first volume, the Arkan of Islam, that's published. But in any event, this is published and available in the English language as a contemporary book. The English is really solid. These types of books build the student of knowledge in the real sense. The other books, they have their benefit, they have barakah, and I'm not saying don't read them. But really, when you want to understand the grounding in how the scholars think and so on and so forth, they're extremely important. One of the things about the other books that are common that people read in fiqh, one of the points that needs to be understood is that those books are about conceptualizing issues. They're not about grounding the student in knowledge and evidence. They're about getting the student to conceptualize action. Because fiqh is about action, right? When we talk about the madhab or the study of fiqh overall, it's about action, studying action, the actions of a Muslim, the actions which are obligated or the actions which are recommended of the Muslim to practice. There's more to be said in this regard, but as we mentioned, this type of approach towards studying fiqh is very beneficial because it grounds the student in evidence, but it also grounds the student in scholarship. That's not to say that books, like for instance, Fiqh According to the Quran and the Sunnah by Subhi Halaq, or Sheikh Saeed Badawi's book in terms of fiqh that was translated by Jamal Din Zarabozo, or Minhaj Muslim by Abu Bakr al-Jazairi. Those books are not necessarily grounded 100% in the madhab. Doesn't mean that they're not influenced. Those books are amazing as well. It's a different orientation, different type of fiqh. The fiqh, the book by Subhi Halaq is important for the student of hadith, although he focuses on one opinion, but it's extremely important for the student of hadith because of what he presents there. Is it the last word on things? No, it's an orientation. But there's a way to do fiqh outside of the four madhab approach, which is systematic as well, right? And a student of Sharia knows that. Student of Sharia in the widest sense knows that. Not a student just of a madhab, but a student of Sharia studies knows that there's different techniques and styles and approaches towards creating fiqh content, so to speak. In each area has a purpose. Like we mentioned, like a lot of the small books that are popular for people to study in madhabi-based fiqh is about developing conceptualizations of how we act as Muslims. So how does the salah look? How do I establish the salah? What invalidates the salah, right? And what kinds of salah practice are there? That type of thing. That's just an example, which that's a little different than saying, what is the basis for the salah? Why do I practice this salah? And then that goes into two areas. One is the understanding the evidences, and the other area is what we call ta'leel, or the objectives behind the acts of ibadah. In some of the books that are written by some scholars like Ibn al-Qayyim or al-Ghazali, those types of people like that, they talk about the objectives of worship, right? And so good scholarship combines between the ta'leel and the tadleel. The ta'leel is the rationale behind it, in terms of his objectives and so on and so forth. And tadleel is the evidences behind it, right? And so a good fiqh approach combines those two, as noted by Sheikh Abu Ghudda, Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, and noted by Sheikh Al-Albani. And this question was posed to Sheikh Ahmed Tahar Riyan Al-Azhari Al-Maliki, the great scholar of Maliki fiqh and comparative fiqh as well, who was one of my teachers, and he said, yes, it's better to learn with evidences, right? I know that in the Hanafi school, if you look at, for instance, some of the writings of Maulana Thanawi, he's against that because he's using a different methodology, different approach, and so on and so forth. But we presented some ideas here, and we hope that they're beneficial. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.